Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is brought to you by Rally Here, the proven gaming backend platform and service made specifically for cross-platform live service games. Providing cutting-edge tooling for matchmaking, cross-platform accounts, server optimization, live ops management, player progression, and community engagement, Rally Here is the one-stop shop to streamline your development processes, increase speed to market, and optimize your post-launch live services. Rally Here powers games that have been played by over 200 million gamers worldwide across PC, console, and mobile, including Smite, Paladins, Rogue Company, and many others. Rally Here's founders were also among the first to embrace cross-platform free-to-play games, meaning the Rally Here solution incorporates over a decade of hard-won experience and learnings in live service games. Rally Here's partnership approach to customer relationships makes them a trusted and experienced co-pilot to help your team as you develop and operate your live service games. So, do you want to know how Rally Here can help you with your live service game? If so, simply head over to rallyhere.gg to learn more and schedule a demo. Again, that is rallyhere.gg. So, with that, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, and welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Niko Vuori. We have a great episode for you today. We are talking again with one of the undisputed leaders in the Web3 space, and that is, of course, Immutable. As longtime listeners will know, we've spoken with Immutable a few times now, and for good reason. They continue to innovate on both the technology and platform side to drive broader Web3 adoption, while simultaneously continuing to ship both first-party and third-party new games at an impressive rate. Today, we're here to talk about Immutable's upcoming major new release, their biggest one yet, called Guild of Guardians. It's a Web3 fantasy RPG, and it has a global launch date very soon, May 15th, which is just over a week away as of this recording. The team has high hopes and expectations for this title, and so we wanted to dig into it further, as well as discuss Immutable's roadmap and how it has evolved since we had Robbie Ferguson, Immutable's co-founder, on the show back in January of this year. So today, we welcome back Justin Hulog, Chief Studio Officer at Immutable. He was last here about a year and a half ago. We were just talking about that before we started, when he gave us his Web3 gaming predictions for 2023, way back in December 2022, when conditions were quite different than they are today. So let's see how accurate you were, Justin. Welcome to the pod.
Great. Niko, glad to be back.
Fantastic. And we also have Chris Clay, or just Clay, who's the VP and Game Director at Immutable, who was responsible for one of the early success stories in Web3, and that is the trading card game Gods Unchained. He has also been one of the driving forces behind Guild of Guardians, and we are delighted to have Chris on the pod to talk about that. Chris.
So very happy to be here. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get right into this episode here. So Justin, Chris, we always start with backgrounds. Justin, we've covered yours, but a year and a half ago, so let's kind of hear from that again. But Clay, why don't we start with you as a first-time guest, at least on this podcast? You've actually been at Immutable since summer of 2019, which is quite a bit longer than most Web3 developers have been developing. So you're one of the kind of OGs in this space. And you were, of course, the game director on Gods Unchained, which is arguably one of the biggest Web3 games still to this day. Certainly was back when it launched. It was a huge deal. So tell us more about how you ended up at Immutable and just your background in general.
Yeah, so for my background, I've been making games for 24 years now. And prior to Immutable, I was at Wizards of the Coast as game director of Magic the Gathering Arena. And joined Immutable for the same reason many people did back in the day, in that Robbie Ferguson reached out and he's like, we need to chat. I need to tell you about this game that we're building. And after an hour-long call with Robbie, I had to talk to James Ferguson. And after an hour-long call with James Ferguson, I had to fly to Australia to meet the team. And it was much, much smaller back then, about 15 people, but very much a shared passion for gaming that I really appreciated. And they had the crypto tech down pat, and they needed somebody who had built and shipped games that last. And that's kind of one of the things my games do, build things to last. And Gods Unchained at this point has stood the test of time. 5 years in crypto years is a lot of years. And looking to do the same with Guild of Guardians, just building upon everything we've learned in that time. And it was a lot.
Fantastic. And we're going to get into a lot of those learnings and some kind of more background on Gods Unchained. I'm very curious to hear about some of the backstory. Eager to take advantage of the fact that you're here, Clay, on this pod and share some of your wisdom and insights. And of course, Magic the Gathering. Gosh, is there a bigger game out there that has stood the test of time? I mean, it's certainly up there in the top 10. So very excited to have you in Web3. And of course, very excited to have you on the pod. Justin, I know you covered this a year and a half ago, but obviously things change quite rapidly, but let's, in crypto in particular. Tell me a little bit more about, refresh our memory on how you got to Immutable, and then what have you been doing in the kind of 16 months or so since we last had you on the pod?
I mean, my story is not that different from Clay's, which is that TLDR, I was tricked by Robbie Ferguson to, and basically I was at a company called Riot Games, which makes like League of Legends and
little games, yeah.
Tiny games.
Things nobody's heard of.
Yeah, and we had just finished launching Arcade. I was very happily settled in Singapore. My family and I were like ready to, we had just bought a house, like all those kinds of things that imply you're going to settle in a place. And I was doing basically this special project, which was like the Web3 strategy or some research for Riot, which got me sent to NFT NYC, the very, very first one. Ran into Robbie Ferguson at a party, had a chat with him. And then somehow, like 3.5 months later, found myself living in Sydney, like whisked away, basically. And have been here for the past, I guess it's almost been like 2.5 years. And what I've been doing is basically taking the Immutable Game Studio and really starting to think through like how we can create strong games that can last the test of time, that have strong core game loops that, are ready for mass market adoption. And so that's basically what I've been doing, is building up the teams both here in Sydney, Singapore, the US, and then, we also have an external studio that we're working with pretty closely in Shanghai. And it's been a wild and exciting ride. So.
I bet. Yeah, I mean, Robbie Ferguson, he is a force of nature. He's not tried to whisk me to Sydney yet, at least yet. But he's been
careful. You'll be swept out of your Piedmont palace suddenly in Sydney.
No, but he's been on the podcast a couple of times, most recently in January of this year. And it was actually great having him on because he kind of laid out, it's a very similar episode actually to yours, Justin, from 2020, early 2023, late 2022, looking forward into the year ahead. Robbie did kind of the same thing for us. And so if our listeners haven't checked out his episode, it's a really good one. A lot of great insights, a lot of great details, more detail than we're going to get here. This episode is more about Guild of Guardians and the gaming side, but Robbie gave us the whole vision for what Immutable is trying to do for the ecosystem, not just in the gaming space. Okay, so as I said, Clay, I'm gonna pick on you here a little bit because it's great to have you on this pod to talk a little bit about Gods Unchained, which, as I mentioned, is definitely one of the OG Web3 games. It's standing the test of time. 5 years, as you mentioned, is an eternity in Web3, and it's still going strong. So why don't you tell a little bit about how that came to be, a little bit about the history of the game, what were the design principles that you were bringing to it from your background with Magic the Gathering, and Web2, and not even Web2, but analog games, literally card-playing games, like physical games. And so how did that all come to be, and how does it compare to where we are today versus what you guys got to start with? Like, what were the tools you had, and where are you today?
Yeah, I mean, when we started, Gods Unchained was already in flight when I joined. They had done the start of the Genesis sale. It was still ongoing when I joined the company. And it's a very similar story to so many Web3 games. They sold a bunch of NFTs and then went and figured out a way to make them work. And that was a lot of the initial job for me. It's how do we take the client for the game, which was built in Unity, and make everything that we had sold work. And it was a big task. There were a lot of cards, but the foundations were there. The art was really good. The world building, a little bit less so. And I think that's something that Justin and I have shared a love of, like, continuing to expand on. But, in those early days, it was, making sense of everything in the world. And really working on the core of the client. And back then it was built on Ethereum. And it was in the days where, maybe we would stop minting if things got up to like 5 or 6 GWE. It's like, it's getting a little pricey, so we're going to slow down. But it was just creating that foundation of tools to make everything work in that ecosystem. And ultimately, Gods Unchained is what led to the creation of Immutable X, because it became very obvious early on with the Genesis sale that Ethereum as a foundation wasn't going to work with what we were building. At this point, Gods Unchained has like 80 million NFTs, and that just wasn't scalable on Ethereum. So, the core team started working on Layer 2. And I would say that, throughout its history, Gods Unchained was like a split purpose. On one end, my goal with it was to build a game that players would play in Web 2. It just happens to have the Web3 components. And with a card game, it just makes so much obvious sense. Like everyone who talks about card gaming, it's like, yes, owning the cards like I do in real life. And that made it easy in some ways and harder in others. It saw many evolutions throughout its history from, basically tokenization with Gods, and then integrating that through that whole ecosystem. And it's been a really important testbed for so many ideas and concepts. We've tried many different, sales. We brought, Sealed in, which has been huge recently for the product. But in many ways, an evolving testbed. On the gameplay side of it, it's a digital card game. The most direct comparison is with Hearthstone.
Yeah.
But with putting our own spin on it, being able to choose your god powers, trying to solve that like sideboarding, problem as well with other systems, and it just continuing to evolve.
But I think the biggest shift that we made, especially when you and I started working together, was, Guild of Guardians and Gods Unchained at first were two separate franchises.
Yeah, two IPs.
Separate worlds. And I remember coming in and being like, wow, it's already difficult enough to manage one IP, let alone try to do two well. So one of the first things we did was to combine the IPs so that we could focus on a single world. And then when we started thinking about Guild of Guardians and how we could, get it ready essentially for the launch that's coming up very soon, one of the things that we really thought about was like, where is the gap in the market right now, just from a pure gameplay perspective? Like, what kind of games fit into people's lives? And so ended up making a game that's quite casual compared to the experience that, was originally sort of put forward. And then second, really thinking about that Web 2 on-ramp to make it easier to kind of go into Web 3, because one of the biggest gaps from at least my perspective in terms of thinking about mainstream adoption was the idea that you actually had to buy the NFTs or have the NFTs in hand first to create the level and all that stuff before you could actually get into the game, versus the flow of GOG is very much game first. And then as you start getting invested, it then pushes you more and more into, Web3 ascension mechanics to develop.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
And that's quite different to Gods Unchained, in the sense that Gods Unchained, you do need to own the card set. You have to have cards to play, otherwise you can't really play.
Yeah, to be fair, in Gods Unchained, you get free packs to start.
For sure, but it is about ownership first and foremost, whether you get them for free or you have to buy them. Like, you have to have this notion of, I have to own these things, and I can either, grind for them or get them for free, or, or buy them, right? Which is exactly what you do in the analog case. But here, I think you're taking a very different approach, which it's almost like, it's always game first, but if you'll excuse the slightly strained analogy, it's game first, ownership second, as opposed to ownership first, game second. However you define the ownership or how you get to the ownership. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's one where, we really want to make sure that the players who get into the ownership mechanics do so of their own after they have the chance to try the core product and make sure that it's the right product for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it really is a continued evolution of so much that we learned on Gods Unchained. So there was the Forge, where you could basically combine cards together to initially bring them onto the blockchain, but also increase their shine on them. And we've gone from that to now we've been using the altar inside of Guild of Guardians to create more complex recipes. So it's also allowed us to solve problems that we couldn't necessarily solve without it, in just like the like Web 2 space to Web 3, with all of the founder guardians, there's actually a limited number of them. There's only, a little over 1,000 Leahs out there in the world. And part of the mechanics for the Guild of Guardians, as you power up your guardians, as you basically combine them, similar to, cards back in the day, except they gain power rather than just shine. But with that limited supply, it meant that if you got to the top tier Leah at, that 15 enlightenment, you'd only have about 120 of them in existence. And the altar with crafting has basically let us solve that problem through, what day is today? Tomorrow. Tomorrow, the recipes for cracked hearts is going to go live, and there'll be a replacement for using duplicates for those founders. And you can basically take, core Gen 1 guardians that people have acquired, or even founder guardians, use the recipes to create these cracked hearts. And having that tool to solve these problems in Web3, allow people to craft, allow people to also just game in the market of buy the guardians that are low to go solve this need. All of that sort of economic interoperability is something that I've had in my mind since we started really pushing on this new path for Guild of Guardians too. How do we make this economy flow beyond just ownership? That was the foundation, but it's it's so much more than that now.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. And actually leads me nicely to a kind of a more market/technical question. When we had Robbie on the show in January, he was talking a lot about how excited he was for Immutable Passport, which, Justin, you just mentioned earlier that we only have so much time on our hands. Players are just looking to play and they don't want to spend a whole bunch of time setting up their wallets. And, this still to this day in 2024, we've been talking about this for years now, ever since, 2018, 2019. Going back all the way to CryptoKitties. Nobody has time to do all that stuff and jump through all those hoops. And despite so many companies coming and promising that they're going to make it frictionless and seamless and easy to onboard and what have you, nobody really has succeeded in that. And I know Robbie was extremely excited about Immutable Passport, but it wasn't quite there was still a bunch of stuff to be done. So I'm curious to hear, where is Immutable Passport now? Actually, maybe Justin, you take this. What does it do? What is Immutable Passport for listeners? Where are you guys at with it? And how does it address this big question mark around, we only have so much time. I want to get into the game. I don't want to be messing around with all this other stuff.
Yeah. So the PR bullet points, right? That to describe Passport is that it's a non-custodial wallet, an authentication solution that streamlines user onboarding and allows you to play it across multiple games and access all of the different marketplaces across Immutable. But the TLDR is that it makes it incredibly easy to log in. And I know this because I've worked with Alex Connolly, who's our CTO, through almost every step of this process, right? Passport and GoG and ZK-EVM are all kind of tied together because we test each other's products. And this is how we sort of dog food it at Immutable. Part of why GoG is so important is because it was the game that ZK-EVM was sort of designed for, with the idea that if we got it right for GoG, we could get it right for everywhere else. And if you think about what the past used to look like, where when you had to create a wallet, you had to collect your seed phrase. And if you didn't understand what that meant, you were not quite sure where you put your seed phrase. And then all of a sudden you'd have all these assets and they get lost or stolen or whatever. Passport means that when you're on your mobile device and you're logging in, it's just as easy to log in as an Apple ID, if not easier. And so, especially when you're thinking about how that works on mobile, if it's that easy on mobile, it makes it much easier on desktop and then allows you to connect everything that you're doing with that one login across all of the other games that you play on Immutable. From my perspective, and the test case that I always use, because when you're working on a game and when you're working at a tech company, it's too easy to get into the weeds of your own work, So yeah, I actually tested on my sister, who doesn't really enjoy any of the blockchain stuff. And so I'm like, hey, just make a passport, test this, see how easy this is to log in. And she's like, oh, she clicks on the link, right? Then there's a code that gets sent to her email. She types in that code, which, shows up as a notification and auto pops in. She's in the game. She's able to do all the stuff and then doesn't feel like she's doing all these complicated blockchain transactions. For me, the user experience is incredibly easy to connect. And what we're starting to see is that prior to GoG's launch, which is in about a week, right, we've seen 500,000 new Passport signups. And the data that we're looking at is starting to show that these are real people who are using their Google accounts to log in because they're excited to start claiming some of the early rewards, excited to start minting some of the new Guardians. that to me shows that like when you have users and for my own personal network, I get pings from my friends who are excited to try to play the game, who are like, hey, I just signed up for my passport. When I go to this altar, what's the recipe for XYZ? Which, is an anecdotal, is an anecdote and not exactly data, but it's really helpful for me to kind of see how people are finding it much easier to start accessing the Web3 elements and how it's starting to become much more seamless in terms of how they start integrating into different games.
Yeah. I mean, that's the vision. Obviously, you guys are immutable. So for you to having Passport work with, air quotes, just immutable is sufficient if you guys are the big winners, of course, in this space. But, my next question is kind of about the promise of Web3 more broadly. And I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts as immutable, as one of the leaders in this space. We had a exceptional guy called Max Fu on the show a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I know Max. I think Max is great.
Yeah, fantastic guy. Like crazy background. Like he was a gastrointestinal surgeon or something like that in a previous life, and he had very strict Chinese parents who he could only be a doctor or a lawyer, and then he became a game developer, and they almost disowned him. But anyway, really fascinating episode. That was 2 weeks ago. If you guys haven't listened to that, I highly recommend it. But he's the founder of a game called Nyan Heroes, which is cats controlling mechs, but it's on Solana. They have 1.3 million pre-registrations, big numbers. They seem to have had a very successful kind of alpha launch, close that down, and they're kind of working on the next one. But the question I have for you guys is like the promise of Web3 is that it's so simple to play any game that has ownership of some sort or has NFTs integrated or any of the Web3 technologies that we've come to embrace. But as of right now, Passport, you can't play a Solana game through Passport and vice versa. If I'm on Solana, I can't go and play an immutable game. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, Robbie had some philosophical thoughts on this, but it's all very well good to have philosophical thoughts. There need to be practical implementation pieces behind it. So what are your responses to that? How do we actually solve the walled garden problem, which is ultimately a big promise of blockchain? A big promise of blockchain is that there are no walled gardens anymore. Anything is possible. I have had this asset here. I can use it over there. There is, composability. Take this, create something new, which is modding from Web 2. So long question here, really, but here it is again, that interoperability question, which is if Immutable wins big, great. You're the Apple of Web 3 and everything else is smaller. But if Web 3's ethos wins, which is it's a completely open ecosystem that anybody can play in and it's frictionless, then we're going to have to solve this interoperability problem somehow. So long question. But I'm going to throw that to both of you guys to think about it a little bit and say, okay, Passport is great for Immutable. Is it great for the ecosystem?
Yeah, and I think this is a question that has a lot of different parts because there's one question about Passport, right? And there's and sort of the ability to log in across different stores. And I think generally speaking, Passport is not necessarily locked to ZK-EVM. If there's another chain that emerges as like a large chain where there's a lot of content, it's really easy for us, to work with that chain to integrate Passport, and so that people can kind of go back and forth between different chains. And even right now, there's connection points between MetaMask, for example, and Passport, which makes it easy for you to do those connection points, right? So that's point one around the login, right? I think though that the reality around is that players are going to go where there's great content. So our first priority at Immutable is to make really, really good content. We have over 200 games that are building on us. The criteria for how we look at those games is not so dissimilar from the way that, that at least I used to look at games at other companies that I used to work at when we were thinking about acquiring game. We're just looking at core game loops with strong retention that are actually fun first, and then thinking about sort of like how the blockchain elements can be built on top of it. And what I think is going to happen is that there's going to be a convergence of a smaller number of chains. Because right now it feels like if you would ask me who our competitors were 2 years ago, I would give you a different answer from a year ago, from a different answer from today.
Yeah.
Right. And all of that stuff constantly is shifting and moving. And for us, we're just very, very focused on get good content, get different genres of games, make sure those games are actually fun, and fun without the blockchain elements on top, because the blockchain elements artificially, or not artificially, but they inflate like your D1, your D7, your D30, right? And then, once we figure out where the majority of that content works, we can then start thinking about how we can kind of do those integrations with those winners once the dust settles. The other and the third point, which is something that Clay and I have been talking a lot, is that one of the things that's really interesting about NFTs and games is that it used to be that the assets in your game were the assets in your game, and they couldn't move. But the reality now is that as game designers, we can think about the longevity of the asset and the longevity of the original game experience that they're in as two separate parts. And we can start thinking about how we can design with other people's assets, with or without their permission, which also becomes really interesting. So, for without saying too much, for GOG right now, we're already talking to sort of other developers and other projects about how we can integrate their assets into our game, and that's with permission. The reality, though, and what's so interesting is that we don't necessarily need their permission to create utility for those assets inside our game. And I'm not sure I've even fully thought through the ramifications of that, but that becomes a really, really interesting tool to think about how designers think, how we should start thinking about, franchise, not just games, but multiple games within a franchise, about how those experiences build out. And I think we're just at the beginning of that, which is what to me is so exciting, is this kind of unknown frontier of how you can start thinking about games and game design generally.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add on to that is I've been pretty consistent in saying that my take on like the Web3 sort of interoperability, I was never a big proponent of it, and when it comes to like having a single NFT that you can play across any game, the technical challenge of that is huge. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. But like as a game developer, I can tell you like my desire to integrate somebody else's NFT at a base level isn't necessarily very high. On the other side of it though, when I look at the ecosystem, like economic interoperability has always been where I've seen the most potential. And this is where solving a problem like this is where an expanded like Alter could be, where right now the recipes are based off of NFTs on ZK-EVM, but depending on where Passport integrates, you could expand that out. So you can take pieces from Base, pieces from Solana, NFTs, combine them through the Alter, performing actions on different chains to get a new output. Through that experience. Again, economic interoperability, you're transforming NFTs, but you can solve some of those problems. I think the other side of it is, as much as, Web3 has, had narratives throughout its time, and I've seen them come and go, we are on a path right now in gaming where you're going to have a chain that wins. You're going to have a second place chain and maybe even a third. But this mass proliferation of gaming chains is going to come down, and you're going to find winners. And I believe Immutable is playing to win. Working with Polygon, at one time a strong competitor of ours, has helped us consolidate more, and like that's a big part of like where it also helps gamers. Like if you're just on Passport, on Immutable ZK-EVM, we can make that experience pretty darn seamless. And that's been big inside of, just Guild of Guardians testing the Web3 functionality now. It's at the point where we're like, I can take this and have my 15-year-old son run through and perform the actions. And he's like, yeah, it's just a little bit slow, Dad. I'm like, yeah, that's blockchain. Sorry, son. Like sometimes blocks take a little bit of time to solve, so much faster than the early days. And I'll keep getting better. But like solving it for everyone, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and I think both of you had great answers to that. My next question was going to be about the fact that we had there's an outfit called Game 7. They do a lot of great research in the Web3 space, and they had one of the very first kind of super comprehensive 30,000 foot level reports that wasn't like sponsored by any particular chain or didn't have any particular agenda. And when I had them on the show, they were telling me that there was over 200 different blockchains, and most of them are catering towards gaming. And it's just not feasible for there to be 200 Epic game stores. There's not 200 Steams possible on the planet. So to your point, Justin, about consolidation, to your point, Clay, about there needs to be some winning happening here, I'm 100% there. And I think we are entering that phase, personally thinking about, okay, like some of these smaller chains are just not going to succeed. Like developers don't want to build on chains that aren't going to have any kind of traction, even if they're interoperable with Immutable and Passport and all these other things, right? So I think you guys are spot on, and I think we're going to see maybe your prediction. This is my prediction, at least for 2024. maybe it'll take into 2025 when some of the funding runs out. But yeah, there's going to be a bunch of consolidation, and I think that 200 is going to get whittled down to a much smaller number.
And if you think about where there's been, like, no one, for example, by the way, much as I love sort of infrastructure, there's very few gamers who are like, oh my God, this game is on AWS. I can't wait to play it. Right? Like that's not it. It's the content that right. gets them excited about it. And then what ends up happening is as a developer, you end up building on the content that makes it easier for you to or on the chains that help you realize your vision. So I think to a certain extent, in the same way that we've seen the consolidation of like cloud infrastructure, right? Like there will be something similar that will happen to blockchains, and it's really going to be about the content. Where the best content are the chains that are going to win.
Yeah, totally. What a phenomenal segue into content, because I was going to switch gears anyway and start talking about Guild of Guardians. So just to give the slight preamble here, I've been reading up a lot about it. I'm excited to see. It looks great. So kudos there. Obviously, how it plays is the key thing. But you've gone out on the record and called it your flagship game, right? And so that's pretty, and that's quotes. That's putting a lot of pressure on yourselves, I think, and putting a lot of expectations out there. And obviously, we hope it lives up to it. But I want to get a sense of why you guys, especially like Clay, maybe this is for you. Tell us about the game itself. So what is it? How does it play? How long has it been in development? All the stuff that our audience is interested in hearing. And then talk a little bit about how come you guys are so confident you're calling it your flagship game. I like the confidence, but I want to hear the root of that confidence.
Yeah, I mean, from my end, if you go back about 17 months in time, was still focused primarily on GU, but Justin had asked me, like, hey, can you spend a day a week on Guild of Guardians? And one of my core competencies is combat, like making combat look and feel good. I'm like, great, I'll pop in and I can do that. And after about a month of getting in the game, working with our partner, had a very uncomfortable conversation with Justin where I was like, hey, Justin, like this is in trouble. Like I've built games for a long time and we're not, 2 months from launch. We're probably 3 to 4 years. And that's not something you want to tell your boss necessarily when a game is supposed to be really close.
And the boss doesn't want to hear that. I'll tell you that for a fact.
Definitely not. But I'm like, I could be wrong. Let's pull in some other people from tech to look at it in more depth. But did a bit of a deep dive, and it was like, we really need to reboot the project. And basically at the start of last year, it was working with the team on like analyzing the mobile space and looking at places where we thought we could win. Obviously going up against Diablo Immortal is challenging. There's a lot of foundation there. And one of the core loops that we were looking at was in this sort of like squad, idle auto RPG space. And, even to today, there's still a lot of room to win there. So I think we made the right call. And it's like, got a core loop. If we can find the right partner, I think we can deliver on this pretty quickly. And here we are, 15 months later from signing with MindLoader and, a week away from launch. And a lot of it was, we want to have a game that is smooth on mobile, that's visually stunning, and that was a companion app. And this was sort of coming from just my experience as a gamer who's a father, and like a lot of my game time is when I'm with my family and I need to, like, I've got something on the side. And Guild of Guardians was kind of built to be something I can play full focus on, but it's also something I can run on the side. And we went really hard for like the first, was it just 4 months?
Yeah.
To Beautiful Corner,
yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I'm going to get 4 hours of gameplay. Like my goal is to get people to play beyond an hour, because back for the original Guild of Guardians, what we saw with 1 hour playtests, people were done after about 20 minutes, and that's never where you want to be with a playtest. And as the Beautiful Corner build came together for Guild of Guardians, it's like, we're getting to the end of the hour and it's 15 minutes past and we haven't even finished typing up our feedback notes yet. We're still playing through. And you took it out to the community. Community had a really positive response to it. Followed that up with friends and family. Again, 4 months later, and it's been just building on that core loop of get in, spend your energy running your guardians through dungeons, leveling them up, acquiring additional resources, go into crafting, which is the other side of it, generating crafting materials with your factories, crafting a bunch of gear which powers up your guardians, and kind of rinse repeating. And at its base, it's a pretty straightforward game. But there's a lot of depth in that with, at this point, 90 plus guardians, with all of the different runes, all of the different monsters and bosses you face. It's simple, yet you take it into that next stage of depth. You add some competition into the mix. So beyond like the story dungeons that you run through, we have the endless dungeon, which is where competition really comes together. And essentially in the endless dungeon, your goal is to get as deep as you can into the dungeon before your guardians fail, and you get more points the deeper you go. As you're going down, you're choosing which rooms to enter. Some are easier, some are harder, depending on like how healthy your guardians are. Do you go through some easy rooms to hopefully hit some additional healing for lesser points, or do you go hit more elite rooms? And it's all about choice. And each run is going to be different. You're going to have different runes that you select which power up your guardians, which sometimes may let you go deeper than others. The rooms you pick, the paths, the guardian combinations, it takes something that at its core is very simple and makes it hard to solve. And in my long time in gaming, like that possibility space is really important to a game's overall longevity. And some of those, it's like in card games, there's so much possibility space because you can use so many different cards in your decks, and like how they combine out makes them really sustainable. And in Guild of Guardians, it's just that combination of the different guardians and their different power levels, the different challenges that you face, that sort of gives it its oomph. And
For the record, by the way, I was not actually mad.
No, he wasn't. I was terrified.
I was not actually.
No, he wasn't mad at me, but
I was not mad at all. Like, for what it's worth, I'm actually very into it. When Clay tells me, "Oh, yeah, there's a problem we have to fix," because I'm like, "Wow, I'm finally useful. Let me jump in and help." But like, I do think that like for me, it's actually quite simple. Video games are 50% art and 50% science. And from the science perspective, when I talk to the board about why we're excited about Guild of Guardians, I point to sort of the retention numbers, right? Which our latest test that we did, which was out in the wild in Indonesia, was 28% D1, right? And then our friends and family test was 48% D1. Way higher.
It was golden cohorted.
Oh yeah, golden.
So we were like 70 plus.
Oh right. So I discounted that.
Yeah.
But the main point is, when you look at those tolerances, those D1 numbers are more than within the range that you expect to see for what like a hit game looks like, right? And then our D30 goes between like 6 to 13 depending on what the cohort looks like, which also is really good. From the art perspective, some of my favorite games, which is kind of so I think I told you before, Niko, that I'm like Filipino and American, as in like I literally spent half my life in the Philippines and then half my life in the US and play both Asian and like US games. Like I love like Fate Grand Order and Epic 7 and Genshin Impact. And so much of what this game has just started to take is like some of the best elements of those games, which is the collection element, the ability to play it on the fly. And much as I think that so many people in the Web3 space are like, and keep in mind I worked on some of these games where like, oh my God, we're going to make the next like League of Legends or like the Web3 Valorant. And I actually know a lot of those people that think that's great. I think that like for the lives that we have right now, games that you can play when you're waiting for your Uber, when you're in between sets at the gym, which is honestly where I test GOG, when you are stuck watching a Netflix show that you didn't pick, that your partner is forcing you to watch for an hour and a half, like those are the games that can fit kind of easily and seamlessly into your life. And that's what Guild of Guardians is trying to target. And we found that people who play this game for an hour are playing it all the time. For just from a purely anecdotal perspective, I knew that we had a good core loop in our hands, but I have my test device and then I use my partner as the other tester. I woke up one morning and my partner was double fisting GOG, not making breakfast. And I was like, oh, okay, like this is ready to start putting into production where we could get out of pre-prod and go into prod, So I think that there's a lot of things to be said about, both the hard facts that we're seeing around what will make this game successful, but also just the fact that the game is pretty fun,
And like that last part of it is, we've had Guild of Guardians live in a Web 2 only sense since January in Canada. And just in a Web 2 sense, it's done well. That's where you're seeing the numbers Justin is talking about. But my experience, over the last 5 years in the Web 3 space is as people get into that Web 3 side of gaming, and Guild of Guardians guides people there very smoothly, the retention, particularly long-term retention, is just so much higher. And I think that combination at launch of a solid Web 2 game with the Web 3 is going to be really strong, which, I'm looking forward to. And then I think the other really important thing, like from Gods Unchained, from my experience with MTGA, like going back to MMORPGs, it's building the game from the start to evolve. And I don't know of, like, I've done a lot, but like particularly with Guild of Guardians, like we built it to evolve, and we can do so much fixing, modding of the game just remotely once it's launched. So we get a build up on iOS, Google Play Store, and we can just change so much of it from the back end, and that sort of mutability of the product makes it so much easier to add new content. And it's one of the things that I guess gives me tons of confidence as a Flagship game. Like MindLoader, like if I made any one good bid,
MindLoader's our partner.
Like MindLoader's our partner, and they have been such a fantastic partner to work with on the product. And their ability to just ship new features is like impressive. So like as we go into launch and beyond, game is definitely not complete. It's not going to be complete for some time to come, which is a very much a good thing, I think, because there's so much room left to evolve it. And I know that working with MindLoader, we can continue that roadmap through 2020. God, what year is it now? 2024 and beyond.
But I think Niko, this is one of the things that I because I also in my role talk to other game companies that are building on Immutable, right? Not necessarily games that totally fall within my purview, but other games that are building. Like I give them advice on how they should think about building their games. And one of the things that we did with GOG that I think is actually pretty important is test the game in a market where no one knows that it's going to be Web3 to make sure the core loop is actually fun independently. Like that's what we do normally in Web2, right? Is like you take your game and you put it out in the wild. You see how it works when it's not juiced up with people who are super excited about that game. And that actually helps you to make choices that, like in a control group, that make sure that the base game is fun, so that when you inject the Web3 elements on top, which kind of acts a little bit like a retention steroid, right? It gives you a higher chance that your game is actually going to be successful in the long term. So, that's been great.
Yeah, I mean, so congratulations. It sounds like some of the metrics are at or beyond what you were hoping for. So that's all very good. It's very impressive. Built it in 15 months, kind of after a retool.
I've never had a harder.
I was going to say that's a tough deadline to hit. So you guys are probably burning the midnight oil a little bit here. I have some questions on the Web3 elements. So you talked a lot about, and as you should, by the way, it's game first. Web 2 doesn't need the Web3 stuff, doesn't need NFTs, doesn't need ownership. Like it just needs to be fun, right? Too many, like over the last few years, too many developers were like, oh, it's going to have all this I mean, I was guilty of exactly the same thing going back to 2020 when we, started our company. So we were all guilty of a lot of the kind of same sins, which was like, oh no, the ownership is like, oh, it's a whale game, and then we're going to figure out the Web 2 fun part later. And like, it's on its head, right? So I like how you're thinking about it. Web 2 first, launching it purely as a Web 2 game, no Web 3 knowledge, even in some of these markets. Leads to the next question though, which is sounds like you've designed a very good game that's easy to play relatively casually, right? Like, I mean, you can't play really hard game, double fisting it, like your partner was playing. And so that kind of leads to a question is like, how compatible is that Web3 component? Tell us actually a little bit about what are the Web3 components that you're planning on introducing. What do you think are the big ones that you're putting in there that are going to be the biggest hit, so to speak, with the players? Why would they be the retention, steroid? And then secondly, are they fully compatible with what sounds like a kind of an auto RPG mode that perhaps, if I'm reading between the lines, many or most players are playing it more casually than they are playing super like hardcore. So once again, a long question, but you guys had a long answer that was really good. I want to dig into that a little bit.
I'm going to take some credit for this one because it was like one of the things that we were looking at in part of our research, which was also driven by some of my experiences. Games like Fate Grand Order, games like Genshin Impact, games like Epic 7 are games that actually have a thriving black market underneath them, right? Like these are games where people will pay to train up and level up characters. These are games where people will pay for accounts through like shady Discord and like WeChat deals to get the specific, like an FGO, like I really want that saber or I really want that rare character so that I can put them into my squad. These are games where, getting rolling for the duplicate so that you can level up the character, where whales will spend hundreds or thousands of dollars in order to capture this market. So to a certain extent, we were trying to find genres where some of the like behavior was incredibly compatible with Web3. And I say this as someone who is very guilty of, at least in Asia, like mildly dolphining out, and at least in Australia, is hardcore whaling.
Dolphining. That's a dolphining out. What? All right, you may have coined that term here. Dolphining out. I mean, obviously,
no. But like compared to so when I moved here from Singapore, my friends were like, "Oh, you're such a you're not a whale. You're like a dolphin." I moved to Australia, and everyone's like, "Oh my god, you're totally a whale, right?" But like it, the thing that becomes really interesting about it is that if you like these types of games where you have to collect and level up and have duplicate characters, and you are used to the Web 2 path where all of those assets are locked to a single account, where you can't really get them from external markets unless you're breaking the terms of service in order to take accounts from shady places, and definitely can't combine the assets from those accounts in order to get what you want, right? Web3 actually offers an incredibly easy and natural solution for you to be able to get those assets, collect those assets in a way that's much more efficient than you would normally in Web 2. And so one of the things that we were thinking about here is I was thinking about like not just real problems that players have from the market research we were doing, but thinking about genres of games where I wish that I actually was able to go buy duplicates of my, for Fate Grand Order, for example, my Saber, right? Or for my Merlin, and be able to kind of collect them off the market instead of just rolling on a single account. So at a base level, just in terms of just that pure functionality, GOG solves that problem for players who love these kinds of collector gacha games where you're trying to build up these super powerful characters. In order to do that, you need to roll and roll and roll. You can now roll and roll and roll on Web 2. We haven't closed that path off. If you want to do it the normal way, you can. But it's much more efficient and actually cheaper for you if you engage with the Web3 portion of it to be able to level up those characters in a way that makes sense. So from my perspective, there's a lot of other Web3 features that we're putting on top of that to make it easier. Things like leaderboards, things like the ability to earn tokens, things like the ability to share, affiliate links. But the core functionality is that if you are actually someone who loves these kind of collector squad gacha RPG games, I think that this has the best potential value out of any of the games out there. And as someone who loves a lot of those games and has accounts on those games that are worth thousands and thousands of dollars, which I can no longer trade easily, to me, I think that actually solves the problem really quite elegantly, So.
All right. So you are both boldly putting for, both gameplay reasons and for, market research / market fit
Let's just say I'm also collecting characters now.
Yeah. All right, you're getting ready for the sell side. Not just for real. Yes, I hear you.
I did buy myself an energy token after the last haul. I was like, man, now it's like what it was going to do. It was like, and then I like, just so you know, guys, I'm buying mine after this one.
There you go. There you go. Love it.
There are other NFTs in the mix. Another big one on the NFT side being guilds, and guilds are just going to be in their infancy in Guild of Guardians at launch. But like long term, actually even not that long term, looking at the roadmap, that's going to be some of what we're evolving next, adding those additional layers into how guilds interact with all of this and what they can do to sort of enhance their guild members' power and crafting some powerful artifacts in the mix. But maybe that'll be a future podcast.
Nice. Well, you're always welcome back anytime. This is a very exciting topic and very interesting to hear. And you're saying flagship game, and you're standing behind it at least at this moment in time. So May 15th is when it's coming out. You teased a little bit, Clay, already about what the kind of post-launch roadmap looks like. Obviously, games are never done. Great to hear that your partner is good at live ops, because live ops in Web3 is by no means guaranteed, and many developers are not that great at it. So you got to have all the you're nodding your head and laughing a little bit here. Yes,
well, I mean, I've done 24 years of basically live games. I've always worked in MMORPGs or like MTGA, and it's like it's kind of in my blood. If you make me make a single player game, I'm just like, wait, how do you do that?
Yeah. Totally. I mean, I'm actually sidebar here. I'm a massive Civilization 6 fan, and that game. I mean, yes, they do a certain level of live ops with like their content packs, but it is so frustrating that the game sits still for a year, 2 years at a time, and it's just, anyway. Don't get me started on that. And as an ex-Zynga PM GM, like that was live ops was in our blood too there. So very contrasting right brain, left brain thing going on here. Okay, so talk a little bit more about what's in the post-launch roadmap post May 15th. Like, what are you looking to accomplish? This is a full public, worldwide launch, so it's a big deal. You're clearly confident that you've got the metrics to back it up. How long is it going to sit? How long are you going to collect data? Do you go to live ops right away and it's feature after feature? Like, here we go. Do you ramp up the team? There are a lot of considerations when you launch a game, especially a big public launch. You can either scale up or you can sit back and wait and watch the numbers come in. Where do you go from here?
This is one of those things where Alyssa called me and she was like, you have to make sure that you're careful.
Yeah.
Too much.
Media training. Well, Clay had the right media training at the start of this podcast.
I mean, at its most basic, like with any launch, a big part of the team is just going to be responding to what we learn. And we've got new A/B testing functionality. We've got a number of things in the mix, particularly with early onboarding, mostly because we found that if people hit 50 minutes of gameplay, they retain way better than market. But if they don't, not quite as well. So it's like getting people to that magic moment, trying to pull that time in. So some of it is just going to be optimizing what is there. But in terms of live operations, I cannot spoil marketing's fun too much, but a lot of it is going to come down to those leaderboards. And this is Web3, and making it really appealing for people to come try out Guild of Guardians to compete for some of those leaderboard rewards. So like in that, like the live operations of endless leaderboards, we've got a new mode called Boss Rush, which is much quicker engagement. So for the whales out there, they don't want to spend the time doing the deep endless runs. They can get more in Boss Rush. We've got PvP, and that live ops schedule of each of those running, and then getting special events into the mix. We also sold a bunch of esports guardians, and you're having rules where you've got to have those guardians to play in the mix is part of like that special eventing beyond just holidays in the mix. So we've got that laid out. We've got our path of additional guardian releases, which I think is going to be big, getting these new guardians into the mix to expand out that possibility space of guardian combinations. And then it's going to be the additional features. And, our roadmap there is not yet done. There's a lot of work to do on the guild side of things. There is additional just hand-holding when it comes to like fleshing out just Web3 onboarding. I think that's going to be a big area that initially the discoverability is not quite where I want it. So we'll be having, external guides, but getting that into the game itself. And then, things like pets in the mix. And it's just going to be getting these features out sort of like one by one. We've got a really good high-level roadmap at the moment. Launch destroys all plans. So, we'll see, in the chaos that is any launch period, exactly where they shift. But yeah, like when it comes to like that high level roadmap, pretty confident at the moment, and definitely dead set on the live operations. I'm not worried there.
But TLDR, Niko, what we can tell you also is that all of those things will be broken into roughly 3 acts over launch, starting on May 15th, ending around August 1st.
Nice.
And each of those different phases will reflect different sort of progressions of this like mythical enemy called the Dread, which will coincide with major feature releases in those 3 acts. So,
so a lot of lore.
Yeah,
it's
a lore-driven act launch thing,
Nice.
which is also tied to the roadmap that Clay is putting together.
Nice.
Yeah.
I have
the reason why this has worked out well. Justin loves
teasing.
the storytelling, world building side of it. It's not that I don't, but I just like making things work.
Yeah.
And you get those two in combination. Like, I can't wait for the world to see the launch trailer. It makes good stuff.
Well, this episode is slated to air on the 14th. So even though we're recording it just over a week plus in advance, what a great time for our listeners who happen to be listening on the day this episode drops. Get out there and get yourself into Guild of Guardians. May 15th is the global public launch. I had so many more questions. I know you guys have a hard stop, and I'm going to respect that. But I do have to ask my final question that I ask all my guests. You can power through these real fast. Web 2, Web 3, analog games, doesn't matter. What are your favorite 3 games you're playing right now or are most excited by? And you can't pick your own.
Web 2 3?
Yeah,
I don't have time. I'm launching a game.
I
don't
know,
have time for 3 games in my life.
We were just talking about this yesterday, which is that like we were talking. So I really love like Paradox games. I think we talked about this on the last podcast. And I have not allowed myself to play anything new until this launch, basically. But
good for you.
Games that I'm excited about Manor Lords. I'm excited to actually try out Manor Lords after May 15th. And then games that I play to like relax that are not me testing GOG are essentially replaying TFT, which was a game that I used to work on, right? And playing Stellaris, which is just the game that I've been playing for years, you know? And I'm only playing those just because I cannot start a new game right now while I'm finishing GOG. So
yeah, I mean, for me, my game time is down a lot right now, but I spend a fair amount of time just trying to play obscure games on Steam, and games that are sort of just a little bit different. One of the big ones right now is Songs of Six. It's a little like Dwarf Fortressy style game that is very meditative, and in the little bit of time I have to like hop on that and playing that. Manor Lords is high on my list post-launch when things calm down.
We're not allowed to play Manor Lords.
Yeah, I know. I have not. I have not. Like I wanted to. I wanted to this weekend, but I resisted. And yeah, some of it is like going back to the old classics too right now. So like Griftlands is one that I've been playing. Can get through a run in just a couple of hours. And yeah.
Well, that's a good list there. Good list there. Yeah, I've been getting kind of nostalgic for old games as well, but we don't have time to get into all of those. So just wanted to say a huge thank you to both of you, Justin, Clay. Thank you so much for coming on the pod today. Real pleasure. Best of luck with the launch, May 15th, Guild of Guardians. A lot of other stuff going on that we didn't get to talk about with Immutable. Robbie teased 100+ games launching in 2024 or mostly launching in 2024. Justin, I think you mentioned 200 games under development, probably not all launching this year. I know you got a hard stop, so I'm going to stop it here. Justin, thank you. Clay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And of course, as always, a big thank you to all of our listeners. We'll be back next week with more interviews, more insights, and more analysis from the weird and wonderful world of Web3. So until next time, friends, stay crypto curious and feel free to send questions, guest recommendations, and comments to me. My email is naavik@naavik.co.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.